Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Good. Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me here. First of all, have I got any teachers here today? Hands up, any teachers? Oh, wow, one or two. That's good. Thank you. And have I got any parents? Yeah, got some parents. Parents, okay. Yes, and have I got any managers? Okay, good. Any teacher trainers? Yeah, it's good. And have I got anybody here with special educational needs? Oh, good. Okay, well, I'll put my hand up as well here on this. I'm going to start off by just saying, yes, thanks. I have special educational needs today because I don't speak Spanish. And so we have a resource here to support me, to intervene, so that I can be supported in terms of this. But also, actually, I do have a special educational need. I'm dyslexic, and I'm the father of 3 dyslexic children. So the reason that I'm involved in this is I want to make education throughout the world good enough for my children to go into. And I'm sure as teachers, you all want to make education good enough for your children to go into as well, yeah? Okay, yes? Yes. Okay, see, okay, fun. Why am I going to talk about elephants at an educational conference? Well, I was asked the question yesterday, am I really going to talk about elephants? And yes, I'm going to talk about elephants. We're all elephants. We're all gigantic elephants. And we all make huge footprints. Because one of the things I think we sometimes tend to forget as teachers is that we work in a little theatre, and that theatre is called the theatre of the classroom. And those children who are in the theatre of the classroom, the education system that they experience is that classroom. And we are the gigantic elephant in that classroom, and we are creating the big footprints to lead them through life. Yeah? Okay, so that's, the title is because of that, and the title is also because whenever I start off any teaching session, I try and make my students learning ready. And how do we make people learning ready? We get the brain to start working. And I'm thinking that possibly by putting this crazy title up, people will be thinking, what's this all about? And that therefore, we've already started questioning what possibly I might be talking about. So, there we go. Essentially, when we're talking about inclusive education, what we're talking about is an education system that has as its underlying principle that all children have an entitlement to education and that all children have the capacity to make progress. So inclusive education is there for all children, and it has this underlying idea that all children should progress and have an education and learn to the maximum of their potential. Every child. Anyway, in terms of what I'm going to do with you, I'd like to start off with a little bit of a game. The instruction is there. I want you to say the colour and not the word. Are you ready for this? Go. Okay, yes. What I want you to do is the colour, not the word. All right? Okay, let's go. Pink, yellow, red, blue, green, black. Okay, let's just stop for a second. Let's just stop. All right. It's just a little bit difficult, isn't it? Yes. All right? And why is it a little bit difficult for us? Because essentially what is going on here is we all work and live in a situation in which we're literate. And so words dominate our consciousness. And these words are in our long-term memory. We're being asked to pick out something, but our brain gives us the first thing, the most important thing, the word, because we live in a literate society. We've all worked in a situation with words. And so it's our long-term memory which is giving us the answer first of all. But there's another piece of our cognition which is operating, because I've asked you to say the colour, not the word. And to do that, you have to think, wait a second, it's the colour. And then you have to pick up the colour, find it, and you have to say the answer. But your long-term memory has already rushed in with the answer. So you have to stop that and do something else. So two bits of cognition are working against each other, and that's why you're finding it a little bit difficult. Long-term memory and working memory. Now, both of those bits of cognition are really important in terms of what we do in the classroom. Long-term memory and working memory. Long-term memory is that little bit of memory, or that big piece of memory, that when we're teaching, we want students retain the knowledge in. We want them to keep it. We want them to hold it forever. Working memory is that piece of cognition that we use within the classroom all the time. That is that little thing like when we were working out, it's the colour, not the word. I've got to say the colour, not the word. So we're having to work out what's going on. Working memory is that little bit of cognition that tells us what we're doing at the moment and what we have to do. And in terms of when you're working with your pupils in the classroom, it's working memory that we're using all of the time. But we want to get into long-term memory. So what I'm going to do with you this morning is run through a training activity that I do with most of the students and the teachers that I work through. And the underlying principle that I give them is that we need to know something about cognition. We need to understand what's happening in terms of cognition, because by understanding a little bit about cognition, we can then improve and develop our teaching the necessary little bit. So it's understanding what's happening in cognition which helps us teach. There's a whole range of things that I'm going to do in terms of that. I know that you can't read those in terms of all the points, but each one will come up individually as we go through it. So let's work through some of those, like this one does. So in terms of what we're doing with our pupils, the role of the teacher is to adapt and change according to the pupils' needs. And what teachers and trainee teachers ask me is, I've got a whole class here. How am I going to work with the child with special educational needs? Or how am I going to work with the children with special educational needs? Because I'm trying to teach a whole class. Is it a familiar question? Okay. What I say to my students when they ask me that question is, if you do the same pitch to the whole class, and by pitch, I mean the level that you set your lesson at. If you do it to the whole class, what are they actually learning? What is every individual in the class actually learning when it's the same pitch? And what I say to them is that they might be learning something, but they may not be learning what you're teaching. The thing about the brain is we're learning all the time. We cannot stop ourselves learning. So when we think, yes, I'm teaching something, the brains of the children might be learning something quite different. So with this idea about the same pitch, first of all, let's just have a look at this. If we're teaching on the same pitch and we've got the whole class, then actually there are going to be some people for who the pitch is just a little bit too high, and there are going to be some who are really quite able that it's just going to be too low. It's actually only going to meet the needs of a relatively small number of pupils within the class. And sometimes the really bright pupils might decide, actually I'm going to have some real fun with this because it's just not getting my interest at all. And some of the most able pupils in the class might well be the worst behaved. And some of the least able think, oh, here we go again, another lesson which I can't get the hang of. I'll just sit here and keep quiet and hope nobody notices me. Okay, so the same pitch tends not to work very well with the whole class. Two concepts I'd just like to explore. I mentioned inclusion at the beginning. Inclusion has the idea that all those children in the class have different needs. Every child. And they all need to be included within what's going on. So an inclusive education system has at its heart that every child has different learning needs. And most modern education systems are moving over to an inclusive approach in terms of what they're doing. Special educational needs tends to be a transitionary position, and that tends to have a focus and say there are some children that have particular special educational needs. Let's try and focus some attention on those. So these inclusion and special educational needs are slightly different terms, and they work in slightly different ways. So if we go back to the example here, an inclusive approach would say that every single child in this class has a different learning need, and we need to accommodate that. And a special educational needs approach would say, there are some children in the class who are gifted and talented. We need to have a specific approach for those, as well as other children who are finding the classroom very challenging. Now, often, when people use the term special educational needs, it's often using sometimes in quite a deficient or derogatory sense, a negative sense. And people find it very interesting when they come to the UK and see the work that people who are doing special educational needs coordinators do within schools, who often have a large number of children who are gifted and talented also that they're working with. So both approaches, special educational needs and inclusion, recognises the breadth of differences within the class. But when we're talking about special educational needs and inclusion, we're also including all those children who are really talented, really able, and sometimes are not being stretched in terms of what's happening in the classroom. Now, yesterday, I was asked by a journalist who met me and spoke to me about this conference, and he asked me a question which I often get asked, which is, if teachers have pupils in their classes with special educational needs, doesn't the standard drop for everybody? Is it a familiar question? And the answer that I gave him, and all the research and all the evidence shows this, that where you recognise, whereas we as teachers recognise that we have children in our class with a wide range of needs, the standards rise and the levels of achievement of the whole class rise. So underlying what I'm going to be talking about this morning is that this approach actually works not just for those children who are finding classroom work challenging in one way or another, but it actually raises the standards of all of the children that we teach. So just to recap, one diet tends to miss most of the pupils. And that's what drives those standards down, because many of the pupils are missing in terms of being incorporated in terms of what happens. Every child in the class has some learning need. Okay, so I'm going to move on. I think we also have to look at what it is that we're actually teaching. Because often what tends to happen is because we're so steeped in the work and the study that we've done, is that sometimes that we forget that our children, the people that we're working with, don't know as much as we know. And in fact, what we're dealing with is often intangible. It isn't easy to grasp. So, for instance, if I were to ask you the question, which subject in the curriculum can you always have a correct answer for, what subject do you think you'd choose? Just have a think about this. Which subject can you say, there's always the correct answer. That one will always, that's a subject which will always have a particular correct answer. What subject? Maths. Fabulous. Yes, maths. Oh, how I wish I'd been a maths teacher. But you know, that doesn't exist. Let me tell you a story. When my daughter when she was much younger, had her birthday, I said to her, Julia, what do you want for your birthday? And she said, Dad, I want some rabbits. So I went to the market. I bought 2 rabbits. I brought them back. I waited next day for her birthday. But that night, I was sitting down in my garden having a glass of red wine, Chilean wine. And my next door neighbor was sitting there as well. And he said, Hi, David, how are you getting on? It's your daughter's birthday tomorrow. What are you getting her for her birthday? I said, Pete, I'm getting her rabbits. And Pete says, fabulous. Because, you know, I have 2 rabbits and I want to get rid of those rabbits. Do you want them to give to your daughter? And I said, Pete, I've already got her 2 rabbits. He said, no problem. Think how she'll be doubly happy. So, I gave my daughter all the rabbits. How many rabbits has my daughter got? What do you know about rabbits? She's got hundreds. 2 plus 2 rabbits doesn't make 4. It makes a nightmare. You know, this morning, I came down for breakfast and I had 2 eggs and 2 sausages. How many breakfasts did I have? So you see, 2 plus 2 does not equal 4. What we're talking about when we're dealing with mathematics, the most objective subject in the curriculum, is completely metaphysical. It doesn't really exist in the real world. There's a whole load of understanding that we have to apply to make it real. The understanding, first of all, is that this squiggle means 2 of exactly the same objects. And that these squiggles and these little lines here mean 2 of exactly the same objects that can't breed or run away or do anything like that, mixed with 2 of exactly the same things, means for that moment that you've got these 4 things together, 4. These lines and squiggles. Mathematics doesn't actually relate to the real world. It's metaphysical in terms of what happens in the classroom. And often mathematics teachers say to me, but we do real life examples. I say, oh yeah, like what? Well, for instance, a steam train is leaving the station. 2 men are digging a hole in the road and 2 other men join. They spend their time talking or smoking cigarettes. No. You see, let me just tell you one other story and we'll forget the stories. When I was little, I went to school and my teacher did a lesson on the Vikings. Now, do you know the Vikings? You know the Vikings? I did a lesson on the Vikings, okay. And it was a fabulous lesson. And I came out to school, and I walked down the road, and I didn't see a single Viking. You know? And so I went all the way home, and then I thought, well, I haven't seen a Viking yet. Maybe they live in the next street. So I went to the next street. Well, I've been walking now for over 60 years. And I've still not seen a Viking. Because, you know, Vikings don't exist. They used to exist. They did used to. I'm sorry to surprise you. They used to, and they existed in that teacher's head. And that teacher knew everything about the Vikings, what buses they caught, their favourite football teams, all sorts of information. Really good, strong stuff. And in that teacher's head, Vikings were real. But they weren't real on my street or down my road. I want you to think about, as teachers, when you're teaching, how much in reality are you teaching that is reality? That actually exists for that child in their world outside the classroom and in the form that you've put it. 2 + 2 = 4. With rabbits, with eggs and sausages? Sorry. You see, it's a hard thing for us to grasp because we've all been through an education system and we've all learned these things as real, tangible things, and they exist in our head and we know everything about them. But our children don't. They don't exist in their world. They're fledglings. We're leading them into that metaphysical knowledge. Some of them may go into the academic world, but many of them won't. And many of them, and I say to my students, you know, this is an interesting conundrum. When does it get real? And my students sit there, because they're all very bright, and say, it gets real when we do postdoctoral studies. Okay, so the knowledge that we're dealing with in the classroom is removed from the reality of the children. It is metaphysical. We're only doing it in the time that exists, that we teach them in the classroom, and afterwards they go out and they go into the real world, and they don't carry very much with them, and they don't get much chance to continue doing it. How often do we meet those children on a regular basis? And how often do we reinforce, or does the world which we're working in and living in reinforce the way that we're doing it? And what are their other realities? All those things we need to consider a little bit. I'm going to move on. Is the brain leaky or sticky? I want you to jot down your answer to that on a little piece of paper in front of you. Okay? What do you think? Is it leaky or is it sticky? Okay, just hold on to it. Hold on to what you're going to say. All right, you need pens and a piece of paper. And don't tell me you've come to one of my seminars without a pen or a piece of paper. Okay, just keep your answer. All right, I'm going to give you a little test. All right? Are you ready for this? I'm going to give you some numbers, and I want you to write the numbers down. So, what am I going to do? Give me some numbers. Okay, and what do I want you to do? Write the numbers. Fabulous. But I only want you to write the numbers down after I've said them, and when I touch them, hit the microphone, okay? So, Tom, when do I want you to write the numbers down? Thank you very much for that, because that's an example, and I'll tell you that a little bit later on, of catastrophic loss, but we'll just come back onto that. All right? All right? Okay. And I'll give you another chance at this. You can redeem yourself. We'll be okay. All right. So I'm going to give you some numbers. You're going to write them down. I don't want you to write the numbers down until I tap the microphone. Tom, when do I want you to write the numbers down?
When you tap the microphone.
Fabulous. Big round of applause. Come on, big round of applause. He's doing so well. He's a gigantic elephant. All right, here we go. We'll just try this out. Okay. 3, 8, 7. And Tom, because you're my favourite pupil in the class, what did you write down?
7.
Okay, I forgot to tell you, I want you to write all the numbers down. Thank you. All right, the whole string. Okay. Tom, I bet you're really pleased you came here today, aren't you? All right, here we go. We'll try the slightly longer string. 6, 4, 1, 2, 9. All right. I'll tell you what all the numbers were. They were 6, 4, 1, 2, 9. Right, now just hold on. I'm going to go now for a slightly longer string of numbers. 7, 3, 8, 4, 2, 1, 6. In this room, there will be about 30% of people between those two sets of numbers that either hadn't got the complete string or have some of them reversed. Let me tell you what they were. 7, 3, 8, 4, 2, 1, 6. Okay. You know, I'm not going to name and shame. I just want to explain why I'm giving you numbers. This is not a maths lesson. Twice we've done maths now. This is not a maths lesson. This is have I got any educational psychologists? I forgot to ask if there's any educational psychologists in the room. All right, good. This is a standard educational psychologist assessment for short-term memory. We can hold certain bits of information in our short-term memory for a certain bit of time, and then we lose it. Okay? So if you didn't get 7, 3, 8, 4, 2, 1, 6, then you've just got slightly, this is part of natural human distribution. You've just got slightly less short-term memory than others who can, because the majority of people can retain information between 5 and 7 numbers. All right. But it's not that skill I want to focus on, because I want you to do something now which is similar but a little bit different. I want you to write them in the opposite order in which I say them. And I'm going to go straight to 5, a string of 5, and I'd like you to have a go at doing it. Are you okay? Would you do that with me? Okay, here we go. Ready? 1, 9, 2, 4, 7. Tom, how did you get on?
Awful. Terrible.
Okay. Tom, and other people, can you remember any of them? No. Okay, good. Thank you. I'm sorry to pick up. Sorry. If you don't remember any of them, and you can't retain them, that actually is catastrophic loss. That's actually what it's called. It's not a joke. It is really called catastrophic, because you cannot retain those. They have gone from your head forever. And I'll just tell you what they were. So those are 7, 4, 2, 9, 1 is what you should have written. All right, okay. But if you don't congratulate yourself too much, because there's a little bit of a twist here. That is a standard educational psychologist assessment for working memory. You have to hold the information and then you have to reverse the order. That's called working memory. And remember at the start we did that little game? And you had to look at that's working memory. That's what children are using all the time in the classroom with metaphysical knowledge. They're holding the activity and they're trying to do something with it. And often, they then suffer from catastrophic loss. They go off task, they forget. Now, when they suffer from catastrophic loss, it doesn't mean the brain suddenly stops and they just sit there and wait to be reminded. They start thinking of something else, like, wouldn't it be good to flick somebody's ear? Or, I've got a big bogey right up my nose. Or whatever it is. They suffer from catastrophic loss. They've gone off task. Now, you'd be surprised at the number of times that I go into a classroom and people point out to me the naughty children or the less able children. And I just sit down and do one or two standard basic educational psychologist assessment. And I just say, that child has a little bit less working memory than the majority of the children in your class. And if you supported that child just a little bit more, you would get more from that child. And by support, we're talking about things like scaffolding. Now, how could I have scaffolded that activity for you so you would have all done better? Well, I was only doing one auditory channel, wasn't I? You were only hearing it. You weren't seeing it. You weren't acting it out. Okay. I want you to turn over all your pieces of paper, please. So you can't see anything at all in terms of numbers or anything. And what I would like you to do is tell me any of those strings of numbers that we've done. Gone forever. Is the brain leaky or sticky? The brain is leaky. It has to be, because it can't retain everything. It's a very efficient learning machine by getting rid of a load of junk all the time. And if the junk happens to be your lesson, then you didn't scaffold it enough. You didn't deal with the metaphysical knowledge that you're dealing with, the intangible, abstract knowledge that you're dealing with. You didn't make it either relevant enough or tangible enough for them to retain it. That's what I tell my students. But anyway. Okay, so we're getting a very simple model of cognition here, which is we've got our input coming in, we've got a processing going on into long-term memory, and we've also got the brain dumping information. And this, in terms of when we're teaching, we often put this down to behaviors. They're not listening, they're not working hard enough, they're not bright enough, they're not able enough. And I said there was a sting in the tail for those people that were very pleased with getting all their string of numbers. Einstein had a very small amount of working memory. When he was 8, he was called a retarded child because of his behavior in class. Many companies look for people with relatively small amounts of working memory because they're strategic thinkers. They have ways of thinking about things that go directly to find the big picture or the point. E equals mc squared. If he hadn't had a small amount of working memory, he might have made a very good accountant. So, often when I am doing these sort of assessments and teachers say to me, well, can I have a look and see what we're doing? I sit with the pupils, look at the scheme of work and the lesson plan, talk about what's happened with the pupils, and they say, no, they don't know this, I don't know what that is. And then I talk to the teacher. I say, well, blah, blah, blah. This child doesn't understand, didn't know about this. And the teachers say to me, but I taught it. You may have taught it, but they didn't learn it. And so what I'm saying here is what we're doing in the classroom doesn't relate to life outside the classroom, is intangible, and doesn't link into existing knowledge, and therefore does not stick. Okay, so what sort of activities, what goes on in the classroom? When children are dealing with this intangible knowledge, what sort of things are going on? What are the activities they have to do? Not just in, oh, they have to sit, they have to listen, they have to write, not just this sort of stuff, but what do they have to do inside? Well, they have to hold the information that we're giving long enough for them to retain it and know what it's about. They have to do often different things at the same time. They have to process quite large amounts of stuff, hold it and put it into the right sort of place and think about it, link new things with existing things. They have to put these sort of things in order and into place. And they have to rehearse this knowledge. And they have to stay on task. And all of those activities are to do with working memory. Working memory that can suffer from catastrophic loss, that can turn off really easily. So when they go off task, they didn't wake up in the morning and go to school and say, oh, I think what I'll do today is not listen very carefully. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about multisensory approaches. And I want to ask you a question. Where are we? Where are we? Now, this moment, where are we? We are in a very dark place. I'm not talking about the university or even the fact that we're in Serena. But we are in a dark place because you all think that you're here. But you're not. You're in here. We exist in here. Everything we do is in here. And this is a dark place. And it only becomes this place because we experience it through our sight, through our touch, through smell, through our senses. Our brain, we live in here, and the outside world, the non-dark place, the light place, we experience through our senses. So to get to the brain, you have to go through the senses. And in terms of these senses, if we just use one, and I just use the auditory channel when we were doing the numbers, it's a little tiny footpath. If we try and get into the brain using two senses, it becomes a little bit of a road. It's a bigger pathway into the brain. And if we use three or more senses, we open up the superhighway into the brain. So everything we do, if we want to get into the brain, must be multisensory. Some children learn in a way which is very similar to us. Well, actually, very similar to you, because I learn in a non-typical way. But some children learn in a non-typical approach. And the reason that people learn in different ways is because the brain is constructed. Different people have different brain constructions, and they process information in different ways. And they often process information very different than we process it. So just because something makes sense to us, it doesn't mean to say it's going to make sense to them, because they process the information different. So, for instance, some people will find sequences problematic. Some people will find the whole area of motor control and coordination problematic. Some people will find reading and keeping an idea where they are on text problematic. Some people may not remember how words are put together. Some people may not be very good at finding the right word. Some people will be not that good at telling left from right. And it's not because they can't learn. They can learn, they all learn, everybody learns. But they often learn in a different way than ways which we would normally know. So I'm going to give you an example, a little story. Sir Richard Branson, have you heard of Sir Richard Branson? Do people know? He runs Virgin Airlines. He's a man with a little goatee beard. He's a very rich person. If you don't know him, it doesn't really matter for the story. But when he went to school, Richard Branson was not considered to be academic. So his parents, who are quite wealthy, said, we've got to send him to a little special tutor who will teach him how to become a businessman. So Richard Branson went to this tutor. Little tiny Richard Branson with his goatee beard went to the tutor. And the tutor wanted to teach him about profit, gross profit and net profit, because you can't go into business if you don't know about gross profit and net profit. Do you know about gross profit and net profit? Richard Branson couldn't learn his lessons. No matter how the teacher taught him, he never grasped the difference between gross profit and net profit. And so eventually, in exasperation, this is in his autobiography, by the way, I'm not making this honest, it's true. In exasperation, the teacher said to him, Richard, what do you think I mean when I talk about net profit? And Richard said, well, I'm thinking of like a fishing net. And the teacher said, yes, Richard, net profit is like a fishing net. You put the net in the water and you pull out a fish, and all the water runs out of the net. The fish is the net profit, and the water that runs away is the gross profit. Non-typical learners learn in a different way. Why non-typical? Well, because the brains operate in a different way. And just to give you, I mean, we've got an image here of a brain. If we were to take out anybody's brain in the room, just for instance, we were just to grab somebody's brain, as one does in a seminar, and we held it out in our hands, it would fall and open up into two halves. Because in fact, we have two brains operating all the time. And one brain controls one side of our body, and the other brain controls the other side of our body. And we have to put both of those things together. In fact, we could try it out now. Is anybody prepared to have their brain taken out? Okay, we'll do a simple activity, all right? I want you to look at something maybe about a meter or so away. How much time have I got? 10 minutes, okay. Look at something about a meter or so away, and then I want you to put one hand over one eye, and the other hand over the other eye, and just looking at this and see what happens. What's happening? It moves. Okay, it seems to move. Why does it move? Well, essentially, it may not move for everybody, don't worry, but it will move for some people. What is happening is the information, you've got information from both eyes. Right eye is going to the left-hand side of the brain, left eye is going to the right-hand side of the brain. When you cover your eye over, you're closing the signal down, and the other side then is getting the signal, and it's just jumping across the two hemispheres of your brain. When we think about whatever we do in terms of cognition, we're using both sides of the brain. And the brain has to put things together. It's not just, so even in that thing, when that thing is moving, the brain is having to put together where everything is and make decisions on our behalf. And when we retrieve information, we have to put things together. Some people tend to like processing in a very linear way, bit by bit by bit by bit by bit. And lots of teachers like to do that. But some people like to look at the whole idea first of all, and then put stuff together. Different ways of doing things. What are we seeing? There's an old woman and a young woman. There's in fact two images there. And some people will see one and some people will see the other. Just talk to the person next to you quickly and say what you're seeing and why you're seeing it. All right, okay. So seeing, when we see something, our brain is doing the seeing. And in terms of these two halves of the brain, there are lots of things that we're crossing the center line of the body and we're moving across the hemispheres of the brain and processing information. Writing is a very good example of that. And some of our pupils who don't write that neatly often have essentially difficulty in terms of coordinating those two sides of the brain. And some of our special educational needs conditions, and I use that in inverted commas, are often to do with processing this information across the two sides of the brain. In fact, the two sides, we have to bring these things together. So when we're talking about a word, for instance, the meaning of the word is in one side of the brain, and the letters and the way we construct it is elsewhere. The point being that we all process it. We're processing information from different parts of our brain and bringing it together. And everybody is processing information differently. And therefore, when we're teaching with a whole class of pupils, we think we're teaching one thing. But 35 people are all seeing that differently and relating to it differently. So, across the brain, sound, symbol, word, meaning, these are in different places of the brain and need to be brought together to get understanding. The letter P. What do you mean it isn't a P? It has all the characteristics of a P, except for one. So what's the problem? What sound does it make? It becomes very different when we put it differently. When the brain processes it differently, these things get in different places. And we can think, this person isn't learning because they've got this thing mixed with this thing. They don't understand it. Well, if some of our children process information differently, I often get asked, well, how can I do it differently? So, for instance, if we can get the sound letters, we can feel it. We can see p and d because they operate in different parts of the mouth. We can teach these things. We can we can show multisensory different ways of teaching things, not just the way that we do it at present. So something like a P can be lots of different things quite easily. And in terms of our P, what sort of brain is it that can take a two-dimensional shape and climb inside it and go, I wonder what it's like to live inside this shape and to move this shape around. What sort of brain, what sort of job does somebody do who climbs inside a two-dimensional shape and makes it something else? What sort of job? What sort of job, what sort of person goes and looks inside a two-dimensional shape to what it's like to live inside it and be inside it? Architect. Some of the finest world's finest architects, and many companies actively search dyslexics to be architects, because exactly the same thing that means they don't have sound symbol relationships becomes they have fantastic three-dimensional skills because they can move things around. So if we consider special educational needs to be a deficiency, we're missing out on the talent that that individual brings. And there are lots of things that use two halves of the brain. I'm going to... All right. Many people talk about removing barriers to learning, and they talk about, well, what we really should have equality. But the problem with equality is that some people come into the system already with an advantage, with privilege. So we actually may then say, well, let's have equity. Let's try and develop something that is a little bit more fair. But really what we should be doing is making sure we're removing any barriers that are there to learning at all. What I've been trying to identify is a range of learning barriers that create the things in the classroom that we see. My first tutor said to me, if some children do not learn in the way you teach, then teach them in the way they learn. Knowing about cognition helps us identify how to adapt our teaching. I'm going to leave it at that point now and ask for questions. I think that's enough for now. Has it been challenging, interesting, rewarding? I hope so. And I hope there's a few questions for you.